These are the words of my grandfather, General Sir Thomas D'Oyley Snow.
I feel sure that the day will come when the student of military history discovers that the retreat of 1914 was not, as is now imagined, a great military achievement, but was a badly bungled affair. If, when that time arrives, my son or grandson, or whoever is in possession of this story, thinks that its publication will be of interest, let him publish it by all means.
General Thomas Snow he's your grandpa, he's my great-grandpa, but I suppose more importantly to the world, he was one of the senior British commanders at the outbreak of World War I. And he played a really important part.
Top 10?
Top 10, he was a top 10 general, yeah, and he played a very important part in the opening exchange of the First World War. And his division was here on the Locato battlefield, waiting for the British Army. They dug in beside him and they decided to fight the second battle of the First World War here on the Western Front. As the general said, "Gentlemen, we will stand and fight to try and buy themselves a bit more time so they could retreat back further into France." And that was part of the famous retreat from Mons, which is one of the most famous and one of the longest retreats in the history of the British Army.
This is terrible ground to fight over. It's totally flat, no cover, and of course if the Germans were beginning to mechanise and they were coming up from over there, heading for over there, and the Brits were in the way, they were in an awful lot of trouble.
Yeah, you know, it was terribly confused. Things were happening very quickly. And General Snow made his headquarters in that town there, Eaucourt, and the Mairie, the mayor's office, is still standing, so we can go and have a look.
Let's do it.
In this church here, there would have been British wounded in this, brought back to this church. This village would have been really a scene of pretty much chaos.
Here we are at the Mairie, which was the headquarters of General Tom Snow. In what state had he arrived?
Well, what's so fascinating, if you look at his diary, he talked constantly about confusion. They'd arrived here in the middle of the night. He wasn't getting proper instructions from his senior officers. He didn't know what was going on at the sort of general headquarters back there. He didn't know where the Germans were. So it's one of confusion, it's one of pretty much chaos.
And he gets desperate enough to ride off up to the ridge here, taking enormous personal risks.
He does. So because he's got no signals here. There's no portable radio, things like that. There's not enough telephone cable. So he gets so frustrated, he rides off to the ridge to see if he can be of any use. Once he gets there, he's under German artillery fire. Of course, a dead general's even more useless than a live general.
Well, he muses in his own diary that it was a stupid thing to do. He could have been killed or captured.
Yeah.
And if anything symbolises this retreat, it's this cobbled road.
This is it. Sort of mid-afternoon, late afternoon, you'd have seen German units swarming across this ridge and the Brits retreating. This brigade here would have used this exact road. It's very exciting to find it still cobbled. And because all the soldiers, and General Snow in his diary talks about these cobbles and the tough effect that had on the men's limbs and joints as they were marching on them for miles on end. And this road would have been chock full, units mixed up, people from Argyll and Southern Highlanders next to people from Cornwall, and of course French civilians as well, desperately, all their possessions piled on wagons.
He was a soldier, but at the end of the day, was he a donkey when it came to his generalship?
It's such a big question. Were these First War generals donkeys? Was our ancestor, was he a donkey? Was he incompetent? And he had fought his whole life. He was a professional soldier. He wasn't just some desk jockey. He'd fought in Southern Africa. He'd fought in Egypt and Sudan. He'd fought in India. And I think lots of historians are now saying, look, they were confronted with a set of circumstances that no one had ever seen before. Things had just been invented. Things were being invented that was changing warfare more rapidly than any other period in history. And the generals weren't ready. It took them a while to come to terms with that. And in that while, hundreds of thousands of men died. So it was a hideous learning process.
I blame no particular general nor his staff. Each one was as bad, or I should say as ignorant as the other. We were dealing with much larger forces than we had ever dealt with.
How do you think the war affects Le Cateau now?
Before 1914, the town was very industrial, with a great many textile factories and thousands of workers. But everything was in ruins by 1918. After that, Le Cateau went into decline. It lost inhabitants, and it never again found the dynamism of those days.
There was carnage on all sides, German, French and British, of course.
Almost 1,000 Brits were killed outright, 2,500 probably wounded, and as many taken prisoner as the British retreated and the Germans advanced. And I think German casualties are approximately the same, but obviously much fewer prisoners because they were advancing. And that puts it on a par with D-Day in terms of the number of people killed and wounded. And yet this is just one battle of almost countless battles of the Western Front, and they only got bigger and more destructive from here. This was a taster of things to come.
General Jon Snow brought 18,000 men into this battle. How many do you think actually survived the war?
It's very hard to say. I mean, I think of the regular soldiers at the start of the war, of which all of General Snow's soldiers were, I think a fractional amount would have survived the war.
And now it's raining, just as it did on that day.
It started pouring at the end of the day, yeah.
And I read here, a soldier, a soldier, a soldier, a soldier, a soldier, a soldier, a soldier. No names. Why?
I think with this battle, because the Germans would have buried these men after the battle because they were in possession of the battlefield, the Brits retreated, so they wouldn't have necessarily kept a record of who was where. And then when the Brits came to reorder the cemetery in 1918 and afterwards, the corpses would have been difficult to identify, and so they'd have just had a lot of unknown bodies from 4 years before.
It's just doubly mournful in this appalling weather and the flatness of the land, and these remembrances just standing here despite the garden and the rest. It's a wonderful memorial to a terrible event.